Okay, well, I'm pleased to be joined by Warren Hanson, President, CEO, and founder of Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. For the last 27 years, Warren has led the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund and worked closely with state and local governments, philanthropic organizations, institutional investors, and community leaders to assemble resources and design strategies to meet affordable housing needs across the state. To date, the nonprofit has provided direct financing of nearly $1 billion and mobilized another $3.1 billion in investments in housing, resulting in the financing of more than 20,000 affordable homes throughout Minnesota. And I guess kind of the news hook here is that Warren just recently announced his plans to retire after 27 years with the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. And so congrats on that, Warren, first of all.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining me today. So I understand that you will be retiring effective later in the year. Is it July? And then
It'll be July. Yeah.
okay. And then you'll be staying on as sort of during a transition process through the rest of the year. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'll be kind of advising in the background until year end and getting out of the way, but providing any value I can for the new CEO.
Okay, great. Well, I gave a brief introduction there of Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, but I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and just talk a little bit more about the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund and its mission.
Sure. Well, the thing that I think is unique about Greater Minnesota Housing Fund is that it was started, the genesis of it was a collaboration between McKnight Foundation and Blandin Foundation. So it came out of the philanthropic leadership of those two foundations in 1996 at a time when Arne Carlson was governor. And this is a little bit deja vu, but the state was having a red hot, white hot economy. Employers were trying to add employees. They needed workers. There was a serious housing shortage, workforce housing shortage throughout the whole state. I remember we had a clipping service back then, and we I bet we clipped 50 headlines: worker shortage, housing shortage, preventing job growth, preventing economic expansion, and so forth. And so it was really a response to a dire shortage of affordable housing for the state's workforce. And through the generosity of these two great foundations, Blandin Foundation based in Grand Rapids and McKnight, of course, based here and came out of the 3M founders' families, they joined together, spent about a year developing plans, which I had the privilege of developing with them and facilitating this collaboration. But they started the organization by writing a $25 million grant check to launch the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, which was then dedicated at its inception just for Greater Minnesota, just for the 80 counties outside the 7-county metro area. So it had this rural and kind of non-Twin Cities focus. At the time, it was kind of a complementary organization to the Twin Cities Family Housing Fund, which had the Twin Cities as its mission. So that was the inception of it. I had, like I said, the privilege of helping to design it and launch it. I applied for the job and miraculously got the job of running it. But there were a lot of other people who wanted to lead this organization. But I'm humbled by the fact that I was able to take that role and do it for almost 3 decades.
Mm-hmm.
And it had an interesting evolution. Like all good plans, God laughs, at the plans that men and women make. So within 12 months of starting the fund, there was a massive flood in the Red River Valley in 1997, destroyed East Grand
Mhm.
Forks and even whole neighborhoods in Moorhead and so forth. And so, as much as we were going to work on workforce housing, we worked on flood recovery for a couple of years. But then we got down to business with workforce housing. And, over time, we worked with, many of the household names, employer names in greater Minnesota: Mayo Clinic, DigiKey, Hormel, Genio, AgCo, which is a manufacturer of um, farm equipment in Jackson, Minnesota. And a lot of employers really came to the table with resources. At one point, we added it up, and employers in greater Minnesota invested about $20 million in
Mm.
workforce housing in their communities. And so that was a major part of what we did for many, many years. And then, other things came along that were profoundly important for the organization to focus on, including ending homelessness and ending veterans homelessness. And we really have invested a lot of time in helping to lead those efforts and finance and fund a lot of permanent supportive housing.
Mm.
Um, we had maybe 2 or 3 really major milestones over the past 30 years in terms of the organization's development. So we started out as a financial intermediary. Today, it's known as a community development financial institution, and it was certified by the U.S. Treasury as a CDFI. So it does get some federal money today,
Mm.
but it also grew as a CDFI and made a lot of loans and grants to pretty much every affordable housing developer in the state, both nonprofit and for-profit developers in all 80 counties of greater Minnesota. And then about 15 years ago, about halfway through its life so far, it took on and began to work in the metro area because there's just a shortage of resources in the metro as well. And we had been successful at setting up some new funding streams
Mm.
for affordable housing that included the metro. And one of those funding streams was to establish a NOAA impact fund, a naturally occurring affordable housing impact fund. And that was a $33 million fund, kind of a new subsidiary. Right around the time of the foreclosure crisis, in 2008, we set up the Minnesota Equity Fund, another subsidiary entity, and that has assembled capital for low-income housing tax credit developments, which we've financed all over Minnesota, Metro, and Greater Min, including some transactions in Wisconsin. And the Minnesota Equity Fund has now financed a little over $120 million. The NOAA Equity Fund has financed about $33 million of projects or loans and investments. And our, CDFI arm, the kind of the mothership of the organization, has financed. Well, if you add them all together, it's almost $1 billion that you said in the beginning that we have provided capital for directly.
Yeah. And so so it started out with more of a focus on greater Minnesota, but now you're also involved just pretty much throughout the state. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, how I'm curious, when you started this job in 1996 and compared to now, how have the challenges changed, or what's the biggest difference in terms of the affordable? Because everybody's been talking about the need for workforce housing, affordable housing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly homes aren't getting any cheaper. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. But what's the biggest difference between then and now in terms of addressing this challenge?
Well, I would say the crisis has gotten worse, quite frankly, and it's hard to admit that we've lost ground, but I think that we are um, really struggling as a state and as a nation with meeting the needs of our community, our lower income households. So, like you said, wages haven't kept up with housing costs, and a great example of that is we just are have been working on a single family development in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. They had a school that needed to be. They consolidated their school district. They removed the building from this city block in Grand Rapids, and now there's space and lots for 24 homes. And we put the homes out for bid, or the plans out for bid. And the home costs in Grand Rapids, which you think maybe the prices or the cost of construction might be less in greater Minnesota, but they're not. The bids came in at about $375,000 per unit for a modest 2-bedroom home. And the wages in Grand Rapids are just not high enough for those people, for most people, to afford those homes. So they each need about $100,000 worth of subsidy to make them affordable. And they will be land trust homes developed by One Roof out of Duluth, along with the Itasca HRA. But I would just say that these home prices and construction costs, material costs, supply chain problems, lack of labor has just gotten worse than it ever has been. And I think greater Minnesota has a harder challenge with it just because wages are that much more depressed or lower. And you still have the same construction costs as you would have in the metro, because it costs about that much to build a single family home in the metro.
Yeah, right, right. And the land costs are, I would imagine, land costs tend to be higher in the metro, but how much of that is a factor in the homes that you're building out in greater Minnesota?
Land costs can be quite a bit cheaper in greater Min, but relatively speaking, it does leave it leaves a larger part of the population or the workforce behind in terms of affordability, just because wages are that much lower in greater Min.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you did prior to your work with Greater Minnesota Housing Fund?
Yeah, I had an interesting career before Greater Minnesota Housing Fund too. I'll start with the fact that I was a neighborhood community development staff person at the West Bank Community Development Corporation in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, and worked on the redevelopment of that urban renewal area. It was a classic urban renewal area, a new town in town development funded with HUD money that was going to put 10 stages of Cedar Square West throughout the whole neighborhood. And it was stopped through a lot of protesting and litigation. And the West Bank CDC had the pleasure of being designated as the developer for the little bit more modest approach to that redevelopment project. And I spent almost 10 years at West Bank Community Development Corporation doing small business development. We founded a West Bank Theater District, started some co-op organizations and businesses up and down Cedar Avenue. And then George Latimer called me up. He was mayor of St. Paul at the time and asked me to come over to St. Paul. And I landed in St. Paul Planning and Economic Development, running the neighborhood development division for Mayor Latimer, and then ended up running the riverfront development division of the city, and worked for both George Latimer and Jim Scheibel, and then for a short amount of time for Mayor Coleman. the first mayor Coleman, Norm Coleman.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it was during that period of time, shortly after that, that I started working with McKnight and Blandin Foundation to start Greater Minnesota Housing Fund.
Hmm.
So I kind of
Interesting.
went from the neighborhoods to the city and then to the
Yeah.
whole state.
Yeah. Yeah. I also noticed from your bio that you, among other things, uh, co-founded public radio station Fresh Air, KFAI FM, and was an organizer of Minnesota's early food co-op movement. How did you get involved in that?
Well, that was a long time ago, but it was a very exciting time for anybody involved in the food co-op movement because there was only one food co-op in Minnesota at that time, and it was called the North Country Co-op. And people came from all over the state to shop there. It was in the West Bank neighborhood, and it was so jammed that the organizers of that co-op said, "Don't come here anymore. Start your own food co-op." And so there's
Mhm.
almost a whole army of people that went around and started food co-ops in their neighborhood. And so I was involved in starting a few of the different food co-ops as a food co-op organizer. Loved it.
Mhm.
It was a real community, still a wonderful network of neighborhood institutions and really anchors to their community, including Seward Co-op and other co-ops in the Twin Cities. But I think I was just attracted to community development from the start
Mhm.
and loved the entrepreneurial phases of these projects.
Mhm.
And realized after a certain period of time that I really enjoyed um, anything that had to do with improving neighborhoods or communities, whether it was small businesses and food co-ops or affordable housing or uh, even cultural institutions like the West Bank Theater District.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, when you look back over the last 27 years, what stands out? Or are there any particular highlights or particular projects that you worked on that sort
Hmm.
of stand out?
Well, sometimes the things that stand out in your mind are maybe not that noticeable by other people, but for me,
Mhm.
there was a individual who was a kindred spirit to me in Duluth named Steve O'Neill, who has passed. He was a community organizer, a homeless advocate, and became a St. Louis County commissioner at a certain point, and a very revered person because of his commitment to the homeless and to the community. Uh, and he was on our board for a time as well. And so there's a project in Duluth called Steve O'Neill Apartments, which was named after him, after he passed. And it's just a wonderful permanent supportive housing project in the Hillside neighborhood above downtown Duluth, houses families with children. So every unit is occupied by um, infants in many cases and young children. There's a child care center on the first floor, and it's just a beautiful building and a beautiful project. And it's transforming lives and saving lives. And young mothers and young fathers are living there and getting established and bringing up their children
Mhm.
and making life it's made life so much better. It was created by Center City Housing Corporation, which is just another great nonprofit organization based in Duluth that works all over the whole state on
Mhm.
creating permanent supportive housing in places like Rochester and Duluth and St. Cloud and other communities.
Well, that's
So
great.
that's the kind of project that kind of warms
Yeah.
your heart and
Yeah.
also that you did something good
Yeah,
by
for sure.
supporting it.
And I'm curious because there's so many layers to this. When you talk about workforce housing, affordable housing, you have the everything from addressing the problem of homelessness to all the different levels of AMI, and where do
Mhm.
you prioritize, or how do you choose, I guess, where to direct your resources?
Well, I think Greater Minnesota Housing Fund has been a combination of it had the ability to do two somewhat disparate things. One, I would say the majority of what our organization has done throughout its entire life is responded to local needs, local and regional needs that were identified locally by
Mhm.
community members, by elected officials, by civic leaders, by employers, who said, we need help. This is what we need in our community. Can you support our work in some way? And we've consistently responded to that call to action, if you will. And
Mhm.
then there have been other times when we had a vision and we thought we can work smarter, or we can respond a little bit more creatively, or maybe take the lead on something. Um, and we've done that in a couple of different cases where we, at one point, identified the greening of affordable housing as important to make it more energy efficient, make it more healthy. And
Mhm.
we worked with Enterprise Community Partners, a national organization, and the Family Housing Fund to really advance those principles. And we got the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to adopt those principles as well. So that's kind of a systems change thing, but it came out of a vision that we kind of incubated. Another idea along those lines was we knew that many employers in Minnesota wanted help to address their workforce housing needs locally, and cities wanted that help too. And so we created a program called Employer Assisted Housing and assembled resources programmatically, and it really advanced a lot of the learnings about how to uh, make it possible for employers to invest in affordable housing that would serve their community and their employees. Um, and right now, by the way, we're operating two really interesting programs that come out of a kind of a vision that we had, which is there. We have a program called Emerging Developers of Color,
Mhm.
and what we have done is we've invested. This is about a 2 to 3 year old initiative, which we started after the murder of George Floyd,
Mhm.
to help small emerging developers get into the affordable housing business and become more engaged in the industry, in the affordable housing business, and produce affordable housing. And we have invested about $13 million in 23 projects in the last couple of years with several emerging developers of color in the Twin Cities and some outlying areas. The
Mhm.
other really interesting initiative that kind of came out of a vision that we had is called Housing and Health Equity. And we are working with about 11 or 12 healthcare institutions, household names. I won't mention them right now, but health plans and hospital systems in Minnesota to help them examine how they can work upstream to address health issues, health disparity issues, and invest in affordable housing so that people that really need stable housing have a home, a stable home.
Mhm.
So those are some of the um, both responding to local initiatives or local plans, local demands for workforce housing and housing for those that are at risk of homelessness and and then also kind of advancing some new ideas and new strategies that uh, maybe couldn't get done at the level of one city taking
Mhm.
on a strategy like that. But if we offered it to the whole state, then maybe multiple cities could actually participate in emerging developers of color work or housing and health equity work.
Well, great. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the work you're doing with emerging developers. That was on my list of questions to ask you, and I've done articles on the Inspiring Communities program in St. Paul, and I just recently did a Q&A with an emerging developer who's involved in that program and is doing some good work here. So that's really cool to hear that you're involved in that as well. Um, any parting thoughts or any plans for retirement? Are you going to be doing traveling or still being involved in housing in some way, shape, or form? Or
I do look forward to being involved in the field. I love work. I love being productive. I'm probably one of those people that um, might characterize as a workaholic. So my next chapter is kind of a bit unknown, but I might do some consulting. I'm definitely going to be spending time with family and grandchildren and doing a lot of the usual things that you do when you don't have to work every day. But I also look forward to being part of the community and working on equity and social justice in some form or fashion. And my vehicle for being involved in that kind of work has been affordable housing. It's what I know. And so I hope to be involved in some way, probably a board or a couple of boards. I am working with a group in Northwest Arkansas right now to create kind of a replica or kind of duplicate the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund model. And so that seems to be taking off, and look forward to being involved in that as well.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Warren, and enjoy your retirement and good luck in your future endeavors. And hopefully we can stay in touch and
Thank you.
Chat again in the future.
Thanks, Brian. Good to talk to you.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Callie. Hey, Callie, can you stay on for 2 seconds?
Brian's the host.
Oh, okay. So I'll call you.
Just give me a call. Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.